For 3 years, we believed the K-bar knife sheath was the smoking gun that sealed Bryan Kohberger's fate. But newly unsealed documents from 2025 reveal a forensic nightmare that almost derailed the entire case. From a defense expert ready to testify that the evidence was planted, to the chilling reality of a clean getaway car and 2 unidentified male DNA profiles found at the scene, the prosecution was staring at a potential disaster. Today, we go inside the unsealed autopsy reports and the battle of the experts to reveal the 7 horrifying details that explain why the state was suddenly desperate to make a deal with the man who left a dark heart on his defense table. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. While the public narrative of the Idaho for often focused on the unsealed 2025 documents finally allowed us to see the how. To understand why the prosecution was willing to entertain a plea deal, one must look at the sheer biological complexity of the scene. The house at 1122 King Road was not just a residence. It became a vertical map of a massacre. Forensics experts identified a trail of DNA and blood that told a story of movement, struggle, and a killer who was navigating a labyrinth of intoxication and darkness. The autopsy reports revealed a level of brutality that the early gag orders had successfully shielded from the public. Madison "Maddie" Mogan, found on the 3rd floor, had been profoundly vulnerable. Her blood alcohol concentration, BAC, was a staggering 0.282. In a clinical sense, Maddie was nearing a state of alcohol poisoning, a level of intoxication where motor skills are severely impaired and reaction times are nearly non-existent. This fact became a cornerstone of the prosecution's timeline. Maddie could not have fought back. She suffered 13 stab wounds concentrated on her face, scalp, and neck, with internal damage to her lungs and liver. Next to her, Kaylee Goncalves suffered an even more frenzied attack, with 24 wounds, many to her face and chest. The sheer volume of wounds suggested a killer who was not merely neutralizing a threat, but was engaged in a high-adrenaline overkill. The scene on the 2nd floor was a different story of survival and desperation. Xana Kernadal, unlike her roommates, was awake. With a BAC of 0.229 and amphetamines in her system, she was in a state of hyperarousal. The autopsy revealed 23 wounds to her face, neck, and scalp, but it was the 25 wounds to her arms and hands that told the true story: defensive wounds. Xana fought the blade. The unsealed reports showed that the struggle was so intimate that Xana's blood and DNA were found under the fingernails of her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, while his DNA was found under hers. This suggests they were in close proximity, perhaps reaching for one another in their final moments. Ethan, despite his size, was also vulnerable with a BAC of 0.122 and amphetamines present. He suffered a fatal wound to the jugular vein and wounds to his legs, suggesting he may have been attacked while trying to rise from the bed. What truly baffled investigators and later fueled the defense was the transfer evidence found outside the bedrooms. Blood from Maddie was found on the handrail leading from the 3rd floor to the 2nd. This wasn't a splash. It was a transfer stain, suggesting the killer or a victim had touched the rail with a saturated hand. Further down, in the living room, a transfer stain of Ethan Chapin's blood was found on a half-wall near a beer pong table. This was a critical forensic anomaly because Ethan's body was found entirely within the bedroom. The existence of his blood in the living room suggested a chaotic movement through the house that the initial police theory struggled to explain. Cast-off blood, droplets flung from a weapon in motion, was found on the walls, containing a mixture of Maddie and Kaylee's DNA. This was the signature of a weapon being swung with enough force to spray the environment. Yet, as the defense would later point out, this blood trail seemed to vanish when it reached the exit. While the prosecution saw this blood trail as a map of a lone killer's path, the defense's expert, Dr. Brent Turvey, saw something else entirely, a pattern of movement that he claimed was physically impossible for one man to achieve in just 12 minutes. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. As the case moved toward the 2025 trial date, the defense team dropped a forensic bombshell: the two-attacker theory. Dr. Brent Turvey, a renowned forensic criminologist, prepared a report that challenged the very foundation of the state's lone wolf narrative. Turvey argued that the logistics of the crime, killing 4 people, 2 of whom were in the same bed, and 2 who were awake and fighting, could not have been executed by Bryan Kohberger alone within the 4:04 a.m. to 4:20 a.m. window. He pointed to the divergent wound patterns and the simultaneous nature of the attacks on the second and third floors as evidence of a coordinated strike. The centerpiece of Turvey's argument was the K-bar knife sheath. For years, the public viewed the sheath as the smoking gun because it carried Kohberger's DNA. But Turvey argued that the sheath was staged. He noted that it was found face down, partially tucked under Maddie's leg and partially covered by a comforter. Turvey claimed it was precariously placed, suggesting it hadn't fallen during a struggle but had been positioned there after the murders to frame Kohberger. He pointed to the lack of bloody transfer on the sheath. If Kohberger had dropped it after killing 2 people, Turvey argued it should have been saturated in blood. Instead, it had only minute aspirated droplets, while the sheet beneath it was soaked. To the defense, this was the O.J. Simpson glove of the Idaho case, a piece of evidence that looked too perfect to be true. This theory gained traction because of a glaring hole in the physical evidence: the white Hyundai Elantra. Police had completely dismantled Kohberger's vehicle, pulling up the carpets, removing the seats, and even checking the air filters. They found nothing. Not a single microscopic speck of blood from Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, or Ethan was found in the car he allegedly used to flee the scene. For a crime that left blood dripping through the floorboards of the King Road house, the cleanliness of the getaway car was a forensic miracle. The defense argued that no amount of criminology knowledge could allow a man to exit a blood-soaked tomb and sit in a white cloth interior car without leaving a trace. The prosecution's rebuttal, led by expert Paulette Sutton, was built on the reality of secondary transfer. She argued that a calculated killer could easily use disposable coveralls, shoe booties, or even a simple change of clothes before entering the vehicle. She pointed out that Kohberger's background wasn't just in criminology, it was in forensic psychology. He knew exactly what investigators would look for. Sutton argued that the lack of blood in the car didn't prove his innocence, it proved his forensic awareness. As for the sheath, she argued that it likely became trapped under Maddie's leg during her final reflexive movements, protected by the comforter from the heavy spray of blood that followed. This battle of the experts created a terrifying possibility for the prosecution: a hung jury. While the DNA on the sheath was powerful, the two-attacker theory and the staged evidence claim only needed to convince one juror to create reasonable doubt. The unsealed documents show that this forensic stalemate was the primary driver behind the scenes. The state had the DNA, but the defense had the ghosts. The 2 unknown male DNA profiles found on a handrail and a glove outside the house that the state had declined to run through the national database. With the trial looming and the two-attacker theory threatening to derail the conviction, the prosecution was forced to weigh a risky trial against a certain plea, but a final piece of evidence regarding Kohberger's cell phone pings would ultimately decide his fate. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. By the summer of 2025, the legal maneuverings had reached a breaking point. The unknown male DNA found on the scene, specifically on a handrail inside the house and a glove found in the yard, became the defense's strongest weapon in the court of public opinion. The state's analysts had refused to enter these profiles into CODIS, the national DNA database, arguing that they were non-probative. In a house that frequently hosted parties, they argued unknown DNA was expected and didn't link to the crime. But to a jury, 2 unidentified men at the scene could have been the second attacker Dr. Turvey was theorizing about. This was the gray area where the plea deal was born. The families of the victims were exhausted. They had endured 3 years of graphic autopsy details, staged evidence accusations, and the sight of Bryan Kohberger in a suit, looking like the academic he once hoped to be. The prosecution knew that while they had a 90% chance of a conviction, the 10% risk of a mistrial or an acquittal was a burden the families could not bear. On July 23, 2025, the meticulous Bryan Kohberger made his final move. By pleading guilty to all 4 counts of murder and 1 count of felony burglary, he traded the death penalty for a life behind bars. The plea deal was a tactical surrender. By admitting guilt, Kohberger silenced the two-attacker theory and the staged sheath arguments. It was a confirmation that the DNA on the leather strap wasn't planted. It was left there by his own hand. However, For his supporters and even some forensic enthusiasts, the clean car and the unknown DNA remain points of contention. The 2025 unsealed documents suggest that Kohberger's guilty was not an act of remorse, but a calculated escape from the lethal injection gallows. He chose the slow death of a prison cell over the sudden end he had dealt to the students at King Road. The aftermath for the families was a mixture of relief and residual pain. The dark heart drawing left by his sister Mel served as a final reminder of the collateral damage. Mel's interview with the New York Times in 2026 revealed that the family is still trying to reconcile the forensic reports. The 24 wounds to Kaylee, the 48 to Xana, with the brother who freaked out over a cut from a piece of foil. The identity fracture is complete. There is no longer a brilliant PhD student. There is only the man who will grow old in an Idaho prison, known forever as the architect of the most infamous crime in the state's history. The legacy of the Idaho Four, Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan, is now preserved in a memorial garden where the King Roadhouse once stood. The shadow in the Palouse has lifted, but the lessons of the case remain. It taught us about the power of genetic genealogy, the terrifying reality of forensic awareness in modern killers, and the resilient strength of families who refuse to let their children be defined by the way they died. As Mel Kohberger blows out the candles for her brother every November, she does so in a world that has moved on, leaving Bryan Kohberger to the silence he created in the early morning hours of November 13th. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, empathy, and respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button and comment your thoughts below. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.